You're listening to a short story read by Philip Ballerscheff and also written by Philip Ballerscheff. Once again, if you'd like to read along to the stories that I write, or simply like the blog that I'm reading them from, you can find a link to that in the description of this video. As always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. And of course, leave a comment. So, this is A Scheme. Martin Ames had had dreams of retiring since he was a child. Not from laziness, quite the opposite. He always knew it would take a lot of work. Looking out of the window as a boy was his main source of entertainment on car trips, whether they were short or long. You couldn't do it as an adult unless you weren't the one driving. His parents didn't talk much, nowhere near what you'd have to do to entertain a boy like him. They didn't like to have the radio on either. It distracts your father, his mother would say whenever Martin asked. Like turning on the car's interior light at night, his father always added, trying to tie one warning to another. During one of these trips, Martin saw a bank advertisement and asked his father what interest was. His father looked at him through the rearview mirror. His mother turned her head around, but just for a second or so. She didn't want to strain her neck. His father did his best to explain, taking his time and talking only when there were no cars behind him or before, and they could go at a slower pace. Martin had to wait through these pauses, catching what his father said bit by bit, and piecing it together. Well, he began, when you take out a loan, you pay interest on it. So 1% interest per year on a $100 loan is $1. When you put money in the bank, you're really giving it to them to use, and that's why they give their customers interest. It's not very much now, used to be higher. Martin wanted to know if 1.5% was good. That's what the ad promised. It's better than some, worse than others, his father said. Depends how the market is. It'll change soon enough. With this in mind, Martin dreamed of putting a fortune in the bank and living off the surplus like an allowance. The point was not to touch the money itself, so that he'd be safe no matter what the market did. That same afternoon, when they got home, he looked up the interest rates of every one of their local banks. How vast should his fortune be? He considered 1 million and then abandoned this first scheme. 1 million was an impossibly large number. 100,000 was more reasonable. That was still a very large amount, to be sure, but one he could just manage to imagine by putting it in terms of so and so many years of allowance. He did the math on a loose sheet of paper. Take a 0 from 20 and another from 100,000. Then divide 10,000 by 2 and put a 0 back in the result. At $20 a week, he would need 50,000 weeks to reach $100,000. But by then, he said to himself, not thinking of a specific age, nor of how many years that was, he would have a job and be that much closer to his goal. Martin didn't see the point in keeping the sheet. He put it aside and went away. Even with his fortune so distant, the fundamental idea of sitting back and letting his money work for him remained. Because he was a child, he meant to do this literally. He saw himself as an old man in a rocking chair on the front porch of the house he would own. He'd grow a little patch of wheat, enough to always have something to stick between his lips. His dream was simple in its scope. What if he could have the most freedom the law allowed, and didn't require much imagination? What if what was other people's was his? His father's visit to a car dealership gave Martin something else to wish for. The salesman shook Martin's hand in the same way he greeted his father, who was there to inspect the cars he had in mind. He didn't give Martin a pen, his father said to himself, thinking back to the dealership he had bought that car from a decade ago, remembering the things salesmen used to force on you. Buttons and keychains and yes, even pens. He noted the difference, but kept his complaint to himself. Just want to see it before I commit, Mr. Ames said. The salesman reminded him that no apology was necessary. Mr. Ames went the extra mile anyway. Oh, of course, but I want to look it over, he said, this time without a response from the salesman, who was beginning to understand what sort of a person he was. Martin, Mr. Ames said suddenly to his son, at a volume just under a shout. Martin turned by instinct towards the sound of his father's voice. I'll test the car. You could stay here, Mr. Ames said, leaving before Martin could object. He and his wife had already agreed on what they would buy, but he wasn't yet totally convinced. I want to see how it drives, he said as he got into the same black SUV he had almost bought the last time he was there. The right car for the right person, the salesman had then quipped, and Mr. Ames and Martin left. He had made himself, from experience and the advice of others, certain rules to live by and some tricks to use. This was how he put people at ease, by never pushing for a sale too much. Now the salesman sat beside his customer, watching him. That's all he did for much of the drive, sit beside him. He let Mr. Ames convince himself. To say more was unnecessary. The man's made up his mind, the salesman thought. He just doesn't know it yet. Martin looked at the other cars, leaning towards their windows to see inside. He was so close that, in winter, he would have fogged them up with his breath. He wondered what kind of people would buy this or that car, and began to play a matching game. He had to go on his assumptions and whatever bits of wisdom his parents had given him. New mid-range cars for the middle class, used cars of the same type for others. He didn't know what the rich, new or old money, drove. Those were at a different lot. He couldn't find them here. Who bought a certain car, he realized, was a different question from who needed it. Truthfully, nobody he knew needed a pickup truck. A friend of his father's, more than one in fact, had bought such a truck. He drove it everywhere without fearing for the safety of his tires. He hardly ever put anything in the back, except when he had to move. That's when he finally found a use for it. Martin thought of owning a car dealership, something which in his mind practically sold itself. His employees could do the rest. He couldn't decide whether he preferred to have his fortune mostly as assets or as money in the bank. He told himself he didn't need to decide just yet. He'd try for both, accepting whatever came his way. Even at his age, he made progress towards his daydream of 100,000, which at night grew to 1,000,000, by getting money where he could. Not, as some people believe boys his age should do, with paper routes and lawn mowing, but with gambling. Had the law not stopped him, Martin would have lost his money to the lottery. Maybe he'd work his nails down good with scratch tickets. Maybe he'd try to guess the winning numbers of the smaller lotteries, where his chances were best. If he were particularly desperate, he would go for the long shot, the longest shot his town's convenience stores had to offer, and take the worst odds he could get. Instead, he gambled at school for 5s and 10s, and when he cleaned the other kids out of their bills, they played for coins. They didn't worry much about getting caught. Those who did didn't play. A boy whose eagerness hadn't quite overcome his doubts asked what they would do if a teacher came over. Martin took charge. The cards were his. He was the one who, so he told the other kids, would bear most of the blame. If a teacher comes over, we'll hide the money in our pockets. It's the most natural place for it to be. How will they know where it came from, anyway? And if they see us with the cards, the boy asked, then we'll say we're playing cards. There's nothing wrong with that, is there? Unless they find the money, which they won't, we'll hide it. Martin was good. So good that these card games became his second allowance, as steady an income as the first. He tucked away all the money he won in his safe box. If someone didn't know the rules to a game, poker for example, Martin offered to play something else. If they insisted on poker, he taught them that. Some kids didn't understand the more complicated rules, no matter how many times he told them the rules. The more complicated games, no matter how many times he told them the rules. Patrick was one such boy, quiet and unassuming. He wore a shirt and shorts no matter the weather, but you couldn't guess he was stupid from that alone, could you? Besides "No" and "Let me show you" and recitations from the rule-book he had almost memorized, Martin sat stone-faced and silent while Patrick made mistakes and he corrected him. He had trouble remembering all the different hands, flush and straight and so on. He would ask Martin for help and so reveal what he had. Keeping down anger at a bad student, Martin found, was like keeping down a smile when you got good cards, in that he was good but needed more practice. Some people, Martin said, frustrated after wasting the better part of recess trying to teach him, learn by playing. You don't learn at all. Patrick didn't react. He sat slumped, his legs and arms sticking out in front of him. He probably didn't even know he'd been insulted, Martin thought. If he did, his head was so thick that no insult could get very far. Martin might cut under his skin, but he'd never cut close to the bone. By the next day, Martin had recovered from his anger. They played blackjack for nothing, Martin's way of making it up to him. He couldn't bring himself to take money from someone he had hurt, or to apologize for what he had done. Sure, he thought as he looked into Patrick's big brown eyes. Sure, he was stupid, but so what? In all this time, his father had given Martin's question about interest no more thought, not until he saw Martin looking out of the car window at another bank ad. Martin waited until they were home to tell him about his dream, but said nothing about his gambling. I'm not greedy, Martin insisted when he had finished his monologue, fearing that's what his talk of money might imply. Of course not. It's just a dream, his father replied. But 1 million wouldn't be enough for what you said. Not that you need it. He searched for a pen and paper, wordlessly at first. Get me a pen, he said, as he found an old sheet to repurpose. He read it while his son looked around. It was some calculation. He took the pen Martin offered and began writing on the other side of the sheet. Look here, he said. Martin did, though he felt he really rather shouldn't, and feared what his father might say. 1% interest on 1 million would be 10,000 a year. He ignored inflation, not wanting to overcomplicate things. His father wrote a 1 and then 6 zeros, of which he crossed off the last 2 and circled the result. That'd be hard to live on. 10 million, you'd have 100,000. He showed Martin how and circled that too. It's not quite what you want, but a lot of people have to make do with a lot less. Martin knew his father didn't mean to accuse him, but he felt ungrateful nonetheless. His father repeated his work with 100 million, which would be 1 million in interest. That's a good round number, he said, looking to Martin. His father knew nothing about what this meant to him. He had no idea of Martin's gambling, and that his winnings, impressive for someone his age, were nowhere near even the smallest of the figures he had written down. Martin nodded. He left the room, thinking of how he'd have to get 1 million, already impossible, and then 100 times that. 100 times the impossible. And then there was the problem of his winnings. Even if he had 1,000, more than he had and short of what he wanted, he couldn't put it in a bank without someone getting suspicious. His father could do it for him, but then he would ask where the money came from. Martin was so put off that he forgot to close the door. His father got up to close it for him. He saw his son's lowered head, but not his face. Martin pulled himself together. His father dismissed it as one of his son's moods. At recess, Sam Richards asked Martin to play poker with him. Martin looked at him, saying nothing. Yesterday, he won all of Sam's allowance. Sam had thought about complaining to his parents, but decided to wait for next week's allowance and win back all he had lost and then some. Well, Sam asked, about to take Martin's silence for his answer. No, Sam would need money first. How else could you bet? And besides, Martin said, he didn't play cards anymore. More kids came to ask him the same question. He told them all he was giving it up. His enemies were relieved. His debtors wondered if he would forgive what they owed him. The IOUs he'd made them sign were all still in his safe box. His friends asked what was wrong. Nothing, he said. It was clearly something, they insisted. He changed tactics. Something was wrong, but he didn't know what. Well, when you find out what it is, tell me, Sam said. Not all of his friends worded it that bluntly, just Sam, really, though the rest felt the same way. They left him to his feelings. He left them to their card games. Martin, home from school, had hardly put down his things when his father approached him. I've been thinking about what you said. If you want to get started on making your fortune, I could set up a savings account. This wasn't what Martin had in mind. He let his father see it in his frank expression. He let his father see it in the blank expression on his face, rather than tell him. Or you could start investing. I could do it for you, his father said. Only what's safe. gold, that sort of stuff. Think of it as a retirement fund. I'll ask you before doing anything. It's your money, after all. Martin said he'd like that very much. With that cleared up, the only thing left was to tell his father about his gambling. Unlike others who made such a confession, Martin asked nothing of his father but that he listen. There were no debts to repay, no apologies to make, and no tears to shed. Martin retrieved his winnings from his room and held them out to his father proudly. It won't be $1 million very soon, but it's a start, his father said, smiling at the end of his sentence. He bought $100 of gold with his own money. Martin repaid him in cash on the spot. A good way to get around transfer fees, his father joked. It didn't occur to Martin that his mother might want a say in this. His father had answered his questions about banking. She hadn't. It was he to whom Martin had gone to confess his dream and his gambling. He who had gone to Martin to talk him into investing. If his mother had taken more of an interest in that, he would have happily included her. Martin's triumphant return to school confused the other kids. He hadn't won anything yesterday. He hadn't played at all. What did he have to be happy about? It was good that they didn't guess. Martin wouldn't have told them anyway. They couldn't have known what he had said to his father, or how much his secret had weighed on him, or how much better he felt without it on his mind. He won often, but not always. Sometimes the money he lost returned to its original owner, who either learned their lesson or else lost it somewhere else, and sometimes the money went to a third person, who received the original owner's anger for taking what was theirs. Martin never gave away what had been his from the start, not if he could help it. Sam, meanwhile, played with the kids who were also out of money, or who, like Patrick, just didn't want to bet anymore. Sam waited for Monday, the day he'd get his allowance. When school was over, Martin brought his winnings to his father for him to invest, keeping about $10 for recreational use and $20 for next week's games. Monday came. Sam asked Martin if he was willing to play. Sure, he said, if you have something to bet with. Other kids soon joined them. Their game went as it had the last time they played. When Sam lost half his money, Martin suggested they stop before it got worse. No, he would get it back, Sam said. He kept losing until Martin stopped playing. Martin gave Sam what he had won and left. Sam looked at the money for a while, then took it, ashamed of his defeat and also of needing Martin's help. Word of Martin's gambling spread quickly in the Ames household. His mother didn't like it. She approached him in the hallway to say so, but not carefully like how Martin had gone to his father. No, she practically cornered him. He could be suspended or expelled, she said, and even if he got lucky, he was still taking advantage of others or else losing the money they worked hard to give him. Martin was surprised that she had confronted him, but should have known she would. He couldn't get out of it by telling her how he hid his cards and his money in his pockets. That didn't address her second worry. Dad said it was fine, he pleaded. Of course he did, she thought. Martin tried to play it down rather than excuse it wholesale. We're not playing for much. I wouldn't even get detention if a teacher found out. She said nothing. He insisted he wouldn't, thinking she didn't believe him. Martin considered telling her he had given it up. No, she would know that was a lie when he gave his father his winnings. He thought she might demand he return the money he had made. To show they agreed on that, he told her he had already done so with Sam. Just yesterday, he said, as if this should be the detail that convinced her he was telling the truth. Whether it was that or the whole of his explanation, she eased up on him. She spoke with her husband that evening. Martin stood at the door to his father's room. He heard the sound of their voices, but not what they said. When the conversation ended, Martin hurried back to his room. He sat on his bed, doing his best to appear innocent. His mother soon came to tell him that they had talked it out. He could play cards after all. It was his money to win or to lose. That was one of his father's lines, Martin thought. It sounded like what he'd say anyway. If you ever get caught, you know what will happen. It's up to you. There was a pause. She turned apologetic. I know I must have scared you a bit, but you understand why I was worried, right? She said. Yes, he did. With that, she left the room, never to speak of this again. Martin kept playing cards, for fun and tokens with Sam, for money with others. Sam still wanted to win his money back out of a strange notion of honor, but Martin refused every time. No matter how much he might plead, it was better to keep the peace. He understood Sam was trying to make up for his mistakes, but knew better than Sam himself that he couldn't. Seeing that Martin wouldn't give in, Sam wanted to call him selfish, even heartless, but decided he would rather declare his honor forever lost than keep complaining and lose Martin too. Sam got over it sooner than he thought he would, and sometimes brought it up as a funny story when they played poker together. They talked about what they might do if they got rich, as Martin shuffled the cards. Sam thought hard because the idea had never occurred to him. "Whatever I want," he said at last, "I could buy the whole school." "No, you couldn't. They wouldn't sell it to you," Martin said. He then spoke of his own plans. He knew he wanted money, but didn't know what he would do once he had it. Money to him meant safety, not anything he could hold. "That's all?" Sam asked. "That's all," Martin said. Whenever Sam won, he made two fists and crossed his arms as if to contain his emotions. Martin was more dignified no matter how a game played out. Sam had fewer chances to celebrate as time went on and they both gambled less. For Martin, it was no longer his only passion. For Sam and most others, it had always been a fad. Martin wasn't much closer to his fortune than before he started playing. He thought back to how his dream began, the innocence with which he imagined it, and the ways it had changed. That was A Scheme, read and written by Philip Ballerscheff. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you'd like to read along, you can find a link to that in the description.